First of all, before I start, I just want to thank IFAS for inviting RHB Asset Management to this wonderful event. I hope everybody is enjoying yourself. And so the topic or the title of my today's presentation is, obviously, it's a bit controversial. US, China, is China winning? So some of you may not be expecting this as a title, but we will try to address this issue over the course of the next 25 minutes. But before I start, I just want to share with everybody what I think is one of the most interesting pictures that I've seen in the recent few months. So this is a picture of Donald Trump taking a photograph with the US physics team, who have won the International Physics Olympiads. So for those of you who may not be so aware of this, so the International Physics Olympiads, it's an international competition whereby different countries all over the world, from China, from Singapore, Malaysia, Europe, everywhere in the world, they will compete to see which country or which teams prevail and who are the smartest in the physics space. So who are the smartest young physicists in the world. So this is the award-winning or the gold medal winner of the 2025 International Physics Olympiad. And that was won by the Americans. Right? So if you look at this picture, you can see Donald Trump grinning year to year. And behind him, we have the US physics team. Surname, Goel, Li, Huang, Zhang, and Yevtushenko. So one Indian, 3 Chinese, and 1 Russian, representing the US and winning the 2025 International Physics Olympiad. So I think this is the irony of 2025. So we have to wonder what Trump is thinking, right? Sitting there, and there's a Li and a Huang and a Zhang behind him, I can't see his hands. Right? So let's move on. Okay, so today we're going to talk about 3 main topics. One is the end of the US exceptionalism trade. Second, we'll talk about recognizing the rise of China. We're going to talk about valuation difference between the two. And last but not least, the China portfolio strategy. Okay, so the end of the US exceptionalism trade. So we are talking about the trade. Okay, I think US is still exceptional. But if you just rewind back the clock 18 months, right, when it was just OpenAI, NVIDIA, the whole world thought that US has already won. Right? They are the best in the AI trade. They have the best technology with NVIDIA, with OpenAI. But lo and behold, in 2026, or coming to 2026, things are different. We have DeepSeek, we have changes in the technology space that actually means that this US exceptionalism trade has probably come to the end. And you can see that from the last 2 speakers who talked about Japan, we talked about Singapore. I think things are changing. Things are changing in the world because of what is happening in the US. So let's talk about US versus China. AI and engineering powers, US versus China. So China produces roughly about 7 times more engineering grads than the US, 1.4 million roughly in China versus roughly about 200,000 in the US. And China produces 50% more STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, PhDs compared to the US, right? And data shows that roughly about 50% of all global top AI researchers in the US actually got their first degree in China, compared to roughly about only 18% of those guys actually got their first degree in the US. Okay, last but not least, if you look at what Meta is doing, right, the proof is in the pudding. You can see that, roughly speaking, about half of Meta's most prestigious super intelligence team, right, roughly half of them actually came from the best Chinese university, right? Moving on, let's talk about soft power shift. I think that's important. So I'm sure all of you are probably quite familiar with what's going on in the world right now. US has conducted a raid in Venezuela, captured the president, brought him to New York to stand trial. So obviously this has totally thrown the world's geopolitics arena into a tailspin. Everybody has got a thing to say. So mainly in the Latin America space, most Latin American countries is condemning this action. I think in Asia, everybody is condemning the action, but in Europe, they are still studying the situation, right? So, but I think sooner or later, they would have to take a side. Because if you look at what US is trying to do now, they're talking about Greenland. So I'm sure all of us are well aware, Greenland technically belongs to Denmark. But US, at least what they are saying on TV, has made it very clear that they are trying to take Greenland either through the nice way, or either that or through force. So I think that will totally throw NATO into a tailspin. So why is this important? Because I think what Trump has done, starting from April of last year, when he started the US trade war against everybody in the world. So it's not just against China, but it's everybody in the world. No matter where you are, even the penguins in Antarctica, it's everybody, right? I think that was a big significant change in the world. Next, what Trump has done on the 3rd of January this year by technically invading Venezuela, forcing a regime change, and now talking about Denmark and Greenland. I think this has totally changed the complexion of how everybody view US and also how everybody view US investment, including the US dollar. Soft power shift, once again. Right? So the inspiration from this AI, obviously AI generated chart, came from this. So this is Putin, right? And Modi and Xi Jinping together. And what I love about this picture is the headlines. This is from NBC, obviously a US newspaper. Car rides and hand-holding. Putin, Modi, and Xi sends Trump appointed message. So totally jealousy, right? Totally jealousy, right? So this is a rare photo op because you have India, Russia, and China coming together, having a party, but without the Americans, right? And that is obviously not normal because if you think about it, India was supposed to be solidly in the camp of the Americans. But things have changed, right? Because of this, right? The 50% tariff that Trump has imposed on India totally changed how India, and obviously the rest of us, view US. So is US being a bully, right? Things obviously are going through all the minds of all the global leaders all over the world. Next, and our US is also alienating not just their traditional foes, but also allies as well. So I'm sure all of you have seen this picture. So this is a picture whereby hundreds of South Koreans were trying to help US build up their factory, their Hyundai factory, right, was raided. And hundreds of these South Koreans, which were obviously in the US legally, were all rounded up by ICE, and they were put into jail. And that created lots of problems, both for the Americans, but also for the South Korean government. Right? So all these things happening, right, I do think that points to a very, very significant change in how the rest of the world view US. And if you can think about, link these headlines back to the first picture that I showed you. So Trump is thinking of imposing 100,000 fee per year for every H-1B visa. So for H-1B visa, for those of you who may not be aware, H-1B visa is very crucial for those who are working in the tech industries. So lots of Indians, for example, Chinese, all over the world. If you want to work in the US, you want to work in the technology industry, Silicon Valley, you need the H-1B visas. But Trump has made it very difficult now. Right? So, end of the day, like I said, all these news articles, all these policy changes that we have seen over the course of the 2025, I think it's the reason why we have seen massive changes in the returns of all the different markets. So for those of you who may not be aware, China was actually up 30% last year in 2025. In 2024, China was up roughly about 18%. And that is way, these 2 years combined together, way beats the American S&P 500, despite the fact that Mac 7 have obviously done very well. So I think change is in the air. Things are changing as we speak. And the best part is nobody really realizes it, right? Because nobody thinks that China will win. So that's why the title is China Winning. Because the stock market definitely is saying that something is changing because China is outperforming US over the course of the last 2 years. So what's wrong with the US? So on this chart here, you can see very clearly, you can see the payroll numbers in the US. Last few months has been horrible, negative, in fact. And moving on, you can see from the labor market perspective, unemployment rate is creeping up. It's still very low, obviously, but it is creeping up. And also inflation, unfortunately, is not coming down anymore. And I think we have yet to see the impact of Trump's tariff war, right, impacting the entire US economy. We think that probably from the first half of this year, we are starting to see that start to creep in. So our view is that I think inflation in the US will continue to be sticky. And if you look at the consumer confidence, right, in the US, consumer sentiments is low, right? Economy is not doing great. Stock market is doing awesome. But the men in the street, they are suffering. So that's why consumer sentiment is in fact deteriorating, and in fact, in some of the lowest levels that we have seen in the last 5 years or so. But in China, obviously not great as well, but at least it's bottoming and in fact recovering. The next part of the session, we're going to talk about the rise of China. I'm sure all of you are well aware of the rise of China, but more importantly, it's important for the market to recognize the rise of China. Because this is not something that has only occurred in 2025. It has already been happening, but what is significant is the market is starting to recognize that there is a change. There is a change. There are fund flows flowing out from the US to other parts of the world. And money will go to where it's easiest to make money. And in my opinion, China. China is their destination of choice. On this slide here, what I've done is we have tried to look at all the generative AI patents globally. You can see there are only 2 countries among the top 10 patent holders in the generative AI space. Only 2 countries are involved. It's a 2-horse race. Nobody else is there. You can see China and obviously US. Number 1 is Google, followed by Zhejiang University, Microsoft, obviously American company, then University of Electronic Science and Technology in China, and Baidu, NVIDIA, IBM, obviously Americans, followed by Chinese, Tsinghua, Hangzhou, and the State Grid. So there's a big difference here, right? Who are the patent holders? In the American space, it's mainly the listed corporates. They're the giants of the AI space. But for the Chinese space, apart from Baidu, the rest of them are all universities or government-linked companies. Then lies the difference, right? One, all the patents are held by listed companies, so the profits, the riches, will accrue to those rare few. But for China, it's very different. The patents are held by universities, by state entities. So it belongs to the country, right? So therein lies the difference, right, between US and China. And you have to ask yourself, if you just look forward 3 years, 5 years from now, which country will have AI that is more prevalent? Which country, US or China, would have AI embedded in the daily life of its people? Is it going to be the American companies who have spent billions or burned billions of dollars to get these patents? Or was it going to be the Chinese? Right? Because end of the day, it's Akong, right? It's the government that has spent money. Right? So it's a very different concept and a very different strategy in terms of how US and China are tackling the AI problem. Next, let's talk about the actual performance of AI model. So this study came from Stanford University. I could have shown you studies from Chinese universities, but then you all tell me Keelong one. So I show you Stanford University, American universities who have studied this and tried to gauge the performance of US versus Chinese AI models. So you can see, obviously, just as recent as January of 2024, obviously US is in the lead, China is behind. But as you can see, over the course of the last few years, right, China is catching up. Is the US still in the lead? Obviously they are in the lead, but China is catching up. And more importantly, is the gap. The gap is getting closer and closer. And to me, that's remarkable. Because obviously US has put onto China lots of technology restriction, right? NVIDIA, ASML cannot do business with the Chinese. No American can help the Chinese in the technology space, right? Despite all of that, right? the Chinese technology space is catching up. But obviously, they are still behind, right? But I think it's the delta that is important, the change that is important, right? If we just project it over the course of the next few years, I think the gap is going to get narrower and narrower. At some point in time in the near future, China might even beat the US. Okay? Next. I think what is also interesting is China's response, right? So Trump is obviously a businessman. He's saying that NVIDIA, yes, you can sell to the Chinese, but I need to have a tax. So I want to make money also. So Trump agreed to let NVIDIA sell their chips into China, and that was very different from what Biden was trying to do during his time. Trump is saying that if you pay me, I will let you do it, right? But what is interesting is also the response from the Chinese. The Chinese is saying that no, bogain, right? They don't need it, right? That's what they are saying, at least. So if you look at actually what is happening on the ground, right? So from a technology perspective, how good are the AI chips versus in China versus the US? So obviously, right now, for the NVIDIA GB200, obviously, it's still way in the lead. So the leading edge one, right? US is in the lead for sure. But if you just go one level down, one tier down, the H100, if you compare the H100 versus the Ascend, Huawei Ascend, which is a China chip, roughly speaking, it's about the same, right? But having said that, at that point in time, what US or what Trump was trying to sell to the Chinese was the H20. If you look at it, H20, come on. This is a spec down chip. China's saying, I don't need it. Okay? Next. I think what's also interesting is also the response from people who are involved in the situation, right? But who are not so sensitive to the geopolitical influences. Then you have, which is, I think, NVIDIA, Jensen Huang. He is saying that China is only nanoseconds behind US, at least in the chip design, right? I'm sure all of you are obviously curious, right? So we've seen so much newspaper articles, headlines about how China is behind, how US is drawing ahead with all these US technology tensions, right? But is it really so? Is China really that far behind? So what I find interesting is also that China is obviously doing is their own projects in order to circumvent all this restriction. So this is the Chinese equivalent of the Manhattan Project, which I'm sure those of you who are history buff would know, that is to build the first atom bomb. So China is doing more or less the same thing. He's trying to surpass US in terms of trying to circumvent all the ASML restriction, or the EUV restriction, and trying to build their version of leading technology chips, right? I think they're making good headways. Of course, we are still years behind, but at least the path forward is clear. They will try to circumvent that. They will try to circumvent all these restrictions. You can't tie them down. You can't just stop them from advancing. You may delay them, but the advancement is clear. And I think what is also interesting is this. So this is the 5-layer cake model espoused by NVIDIA's Jensen Huang. Right? Because all of us are also focused about the chip, right? The chip. NVIDIA, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer. But is it that important? So what I find interesting is what Jensen Huang is saying. He's looking at it as a 5-layer cake. It's not just the chip. Chip is just one layer of the cake. There's energy, there's infrastructure, there's model, and there's application as well. And if you put all of it together, right, because if you want to truly dominate the AI space, you need to dominate all 5 layers of the cake. And arguably, in terms of application, I think China is in the lead. Models, I think both are fighting tooth and nail. On the fundamental model side, I think US is in the lead, but on the more open source model side, I think Chinese is more open source, because like what I said, right? Because most of the patents are held by universities and the country in general. But in terms of infrastructure, China is obviously way ahead. It's so easy for them to build up IT infrastructure, AI infrastructure in China compared to the US. For the chip side, like I said, obviously US is in the head, but I would tongue-in-cheek, I would say it's not just the US, it's the West, including the Dutch ASML, as well as TSMC, which is from Taiwan. So taken together, they're obviously in the lead, right? Last but not least, energy. Energy is also important, but in that space, China has a massive advantage in the energy space. So taken together, I think it's too premature to say that US has won because of their lead in the chip space, which I think that lead is slowly but surely getting eroded away. But if you look at other aspects of this 5-layer cake, right, China is still in the running for sure. Next. Sometimes I think it's too narrow to think about the technology space as just chip alone. Because if you look at the technology landscape, it's much wider than that. The ecosystem is much wider than that. So if you look at in the EV space, for example, so on this chart here, what I've done is I've collated data of all the EV sales from the top 10 brands globally, no matter where they are, no matter where they are sold. You can see the number one brand that had sold about 3.4 million vehicles from January to October of last year is actually BYD. Tesla is number 2 at 1.3 million, roughly speaking. So at the end of the day, right, from January to October of last year, BYD actually outsells Tesla 3-1, right? And if you look at the entire chart, the top 10 names, 7 of the top 10 names are actually from China, right? So if you look at technology in the wider scheme of things, it's not just the chip. But if you look at other aspects of technology, I think China is already in the lead in a lot of it. Case in point, EV. Next point is critical minerals, right? You can see what I've highlighted here. It's a bunch of different aspects of critical minerals, from copper to nickel to cobalt to graphite, rare earth. You can see that the lead that China has already established over everybody else, it's not just the US, over everybody else. They're actually very dominant in especially rare earth, which is why the US, I think, has more or less buckled down a bit in terms of the trade tension, because they know that they need to depend on China for the rare earths, at least in the near future. Next, moving on. I also wanted to take a look at what about different aspects of manufacturing. You can see solar modules, lithium, construction, aircon, electric vehicles, steel, and power semis. So this is China capacity. China capacity as a percentage of global demand. You can see China alone, right, for some of it, like solar modules, lithium, construction, their capacity is much bigger than the entire global demand. So if that's the case, right, how are you going to catch up with China? Because the capacity advantage that they have is humongous. It's not something that you can just overturn with time and with money, because of the lead that China has already established. So that's why the controversial title is China winning. I think to a certain extent, yes, depending on which aspects of technology, or which industries that you are talking about. And this chart here, I just want to touch very briefly. What about the overall global manufacturing landscape? So China dominates, right? Obviously, US is right up there, but if you add up US, you add up Japan, you add up Germany, even if we add up these three together, it's still smaller than China, right? So in the manufacturing space, they definitely dominate, right? So the reason why we are hearing all these headlines about the chip is because this is the space, this is a very important space that they are lagging. That's why the Americans are focusing their energy on trying to slow them down, bring them down, stop them, right? But for the rest of it, right, there's nothing much anybody else can do, because the lead is so massive, right, that China has built up over the course of the last week. That's why you don't hear about it in the newspapers. You might see it on the roads. You can see the BYDs out there, the Aeon. They're all there. They're here in Malaysia, right? And also, let's look at it from a trade perspective. From the trade perspective. So if you were to ask every country in the world and ask them, pick a side, US or China. But then you know, all the countries will just take out the calculator and calculate, so who is more important to me from a monetary sense. So if you look at every country in the world, right, and you ask them, is China or US more important to you? For those countries who says China, then we color it in red. For those of you who say US, you color them in blue. And you can see on this chart here, for most countries in the world, right, it's red. They will answer red because China is more important to them in terms of trade compared to the US. Unfortunately, Those countries that are in blue, unfortunately, are those countries that's having problem now. You have Mexico, you have Canada, and also Europe, right? The Kawan of the old days, right, who are so dependent on the Americans, they are in trouble, right? So from a trade perspective, once again, I just want to put into a perspective for everybody here. I think China is more important than the US for a lot of these countries in the world, especially in the developing part of the world. Okay? Next, let's talk about valuations, right? So obviously, like I said, China has done well in 2024, up roughly about teens. In 2025, it's up about 30%. So the common question that I get is, how much is there to go? Right? So I want to show everybody this chart here. So very simple, just P chart over the course of time, right? Comparing Americans or the US market versus the Chinese market. You can see where the American market is, or the US market is right now, roughly about 28 times PE. Relative to its own history, it's high. Relative to China, it's very high. If you look at China, where is China now? Roughly 15 times PE. Relative to history, it's still a long way to go. And even relative to its own recent bad history, right? You can see I have a line across that shows the COVID lows, right? The COVID lows. That was the lows that China ever traded during the COVID crisis. We are just not that far off from there. So from a valuation perspective, in my opinion, I think China definitely it's definitely more advantageous compared to the US market. So let's look at the specific stocks. I'm sure all of you have heard about the Max 7. So let's talk about the Chinese 7 titans, or the 七大金刚 for China. You can see very clearly that the valuation of the Max 7 in the US is expensive. One is ridiculous. Tesla is trading about 270 times PE. The rest of the technology space roughly about 30 times PE. You look at the China space, right? Similar companies in China are trading roughly at teens, right? And case in point, like I said about BYD, right? BYD is outselling Tesla 3:1. Tesla valuation is 270 times PE. And you look at BYD is trading at 25 times PE, right? Something is definitely not right here. So that's why the title of my presentation is China Winning. And also, if you look at it, I just want everybody to hopefully understand that our view is that we are coming to the end of the US exceptionalism trade. They are still exceptional, but then from a market perspective, right, are they really worth that much? Is the trade really worth it? On the other hand, if you look at China, right, the rise of China, of course we know China is rising, but the thing is, are people recognizing the fact that China is rising? Look at the valuations, right, between the two. 一个天, 一个地, I like to say, but 一个天, 一个地狱, right? It's not heaven and earth, it's heaven and hell, right? Because BYD is trading essentially at 10% of the valuation of Tesla. Does that make sense, right? So then that's why I think it's one of the main reasons why, obviously, like what I mentioned earlier, in terms of AI, in terms of technology, China is improving. It's still behind, but it's still improving. There are certain aspects that China is leading. For example, the EV space, the renewable space, China is leading. And also in terms of valuation, China is very cheap. So that's why over the course of the last 2 years, we have seen money flow coming into China, leaving the US, coming into China, and China has done well for the last 2 years or so. Right? In terms of portfolio strategies, just want to have a brief outline of what we think will continue to drive China markets going forward. I think the AI data cloud space, I think China will continue to do well. I think at the end of the day, like what I mentioned earlier, I think US is going to be there. I think China is going to be there right beside the US. So that's why we are excited there. In terms of internet consumption, I think China is going to be there because applications. So those who have been to China, I'm sure all of you know that before you go to China, you better download your WeChat, you download your Alipay, you download your WePay, you download your AMAP. Right? Because it's so convenient. I'm sure those who realize it's so convenient because they are very good at doing applications. Imagine that plus AI, boom down. Right? So that's why we are very, 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 very positive on the application part. The China capital markets, you can see the market is getting revived. So we are excited because of that. Robotics. right? Our view is that the next wave with AI, or hand in hand with AI, robotics is going to come into place. Obviously, Tesla and Optimus robots is capturing the headlines. But not many of you may be aware that the parts that goes into making the Optimus robots comes from China, right? Last but not least, I think electric vehicles. I think Chinese has an unassailable lead in electric vehicles, and they'll continue to build on that lead, right? So I think these are the 5 key themes that we think will continue to drive the China stock market going forward. With that, I've come to the end of my prepared remarks. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.